Welcome to Motley Fool Conversations. I'm your host, Motley Fool contributor Rich Lumello. Today on the show, I'm thrilled to welcome Dan Ariely, a renowned behavioral economist, professor, author, and entrepreneur whose work has reshaped how we think about decision making, money, motivation, and human nature. Dan's the author of 10 books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers like Predictably Irrational, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and Dollars and Cents. He's delivered some of the most watched TED Talks of all times. He penned a popular Wall Street Journal column for over a decade, and he co-founded multiple companies that apply behavioral science in health and finance and technology. Today, we'll dive into what really kind of drives our financial behavior, why we often get investing wrong, and how we can make smarter choices in an irrational world. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for the lovely introduction. I've been on a podcast from the Motley Fool a few times, and every time it was fun. So I'm looking forward to this.
Excellent. Well, clearly, as you know, kind of laid out in the introduction, there's a lot of ground to cover, and obviously, as you well know, we're an investing website, so we'll probably kind of gear things a little bit that way. But I'd love to. I mean, it's fascinating your studies. I'd love to kind of jump into what originally drew you to study, kind of human irrationality, and maybe touch on how some of your personal experiences helped shape that journey.
Yeah. So the people who are watching us, it's obvious that I have a very funny-looking face. The people who are listening to us, it's you can't tell. I have half a beard. And the reason, there are multiple reasons for the half a beard, but the simplest one is that I have scars on most of my body, including the right side of my face. So I just don't have hair growing on this side. And many years ago, I was badly burned, 70% of my body, 3 years in hospital. And hospital really gave me kind of a magnifying glass on a few topics in society: pain, control, but also relationships, end of life, and that started my journey into trying to figure out what do we understand and are we really doing our best to provide with the best possible outcomes for our patients or customers, whoever it is. And basically what I learned was that there are lots of people with good intentions but not enough knowledge. And as a consequence, they think they're doing what's right for their patients or customers, but they're not. In my case, one example for this was the nurses who thought that ripping off bandages quickly was the best thing for their patients, but it wasn't. And there are many other examples like this. So I'm really kind of a social engineer at heart. I look at the world and I say, what are the topics, what are the areas that I don't like human behavior, that I think we could perform much better? And then I say, and do I have the tools as a social scientist to look into this and find out, are we really not performing as much as we could? And do I have the tools to try and fix it? So take a problem like hate. We certainly have too much hate in the world. I wish we had less. I know it's a big problem. I look at it and I say, but you know what? I don't know what to do. The solutions we have to hate are not relevant. It's very hard to implement them. So I don't know what to do yet. You look at misinformation, you say, okay, topic I also big, important, and so on. I understand it a little bit better. You look at questions about financial decision making, easier. You look at questions about taking care of our health, not as easy as money, but still possible, and so on. So I basically kind of scout the world for problems that I think are big, places where we underperform, and places where I think that social science has some lessons of how to do things better.
Okay, and in kind of in your various books and TED Talks and your column in the journal, what do you think is the biggest single misconception that people have about how they make financial decisions, or the thinking that goes into financial decisions?
So I would say more generally that emotions are a real obstacle for good long-term decisions. Now, emotions have their role. You want to fall in love. You want to enjoy poetry. You want to go to a museum and enjoy a piece of art. So it's not as if I think we should eliminate emotions, but there are topics where emotions don't help us. Emotions are not designed for long-term consequences, right? And if you look at financial investing, that's one of the areas where emotions just derail us every time. So that will be one. And then I think the second thing is that we don't have a real grasp of compound interest. And I'll give you kind of a story about this. I think of the human mind as a vintage Swiss Army knife. And let me tell you what I mean. And there are two parts to this: the vintage and the Swiss Army knife. Let's start with the Swiss Army knife. The Swiss Army knife, as a metaphor, is not particularly good at anything. There's not a single task that comes to your mind. Oh, I want to open a can. I want a screwdriver. Say, oh, the solution, the Swiss Army knife. No. It's not that good at anything. Its greatness is that it's kind of okay in lots of things, and we can easily carry it with us. And our brain, as a decision-making mechanism, is kind of like that. Not particularly great at anything, quite good in lots of things, and we can carry it with us. That's the benefit. But the metaphor is calling for a vintage Swiss Army knife. And what I mean by that is that our brain, as a decision-making mechanism, developed a long time ago for a very different environment. So, we have a tool to deal with snakes. We have a tool to deal with hunger and social pressure and trust and betrayal and all kinds of things like that. We don't have a tool to deal with compound interest. So here we are with this vintage Swiss Army knife in an environment that requires very different tools. We don't have something to deal with credit cards and mortgages and student loans and compound interest and so on. And what it means is that if the environment wants us to perform better, we need better tools. In the same way that in the physical world, we don't say to people, manage. We say, oh, you're not comfortable standing for a long time? Here's a chair. You can't travel great distances? Here's a bicycle. We build things to take our frail human body and make it work for us in the physical world. In the mental world, it's the same thing. Say, oh, you can't calculate compound interest. Let's help you. Let's give you a tool that does this for you. Instead, we don't do that. Instead, we don't help people make better decisions. I think that once we understand how likely we are to fail in the mental world as we fail in the physical world, that we're frail and sensitive and so on, then we can start building better tools. I think that's kind of the hope. The hope is to build better tools for this. So emotions derail us. Things like having to think about compound interest derail us. We get very much committed to our past choices. Again, it's a good thing. You marry somebody. You don't want to wake up every morning and say, did I make the right choice? You buy a stock, you do want to wake up every morning and ask, did I buy the right stock? So, but we end up becoming very committed to past decisions we've made, even they're not in our interest. We don't understand diversification. By the way, the stock market helps us because there are ETFs and mutual funds and so on that helps us diversify to some degree, but we don't intuitively understand diversification. One of my colleagues at Duke teaches finance. And after the 2007-2008 crisis, he told me that quite a few of his students went into banking, Lehman Brothers. And they called him afterward and told him that almost all their stock, all their fortune was in the company's stock. And he said, I taught you for a whole semester. Like the number one topic is diversify. And diversification says, don't invest in the companies that your human capital is involved in, right? That's not the right approach, not to mention, not too much of, he said, it's kind of amazing. Smart people who went to work in banking fail to understand diversification. It's just very much not in our tool set. Our tool set is to say, I know about this, I trust. Like, by the way, if we live in a society, what do you want people to trust too much or to trust not enough? The answer is you want to trust too much, because eventually, if people trust too much, it helps. So we have all of these tools that we carry with us that says trust the people you're with. Not necessarily good. So I would say, if you ask me, like, what are the challenges? It's about emotion getting in the way, not understanding compound interest, not understanding the role of diversification, committing too much to our own choices and staying with them for too long. Those will probably be the basic.
Mm. One of the things
also thinking we can outsmart other people.
Right. Exactly. One thing that I always think of when, kind of thinking about your writings and emotion and the role it plays in investment decisions, I always think to myself, anybody who's been investing in the markets for, even a couple of years, but certainly 20, 30, 40 years, you're going to have the big swings. You're going to have the 10, 15, 20+% corrections. And I think it's just, human nature. You're down 18 or 20%. It's like, oh my God, sell. I got to get out. And, that's the worst possible time to do it.
Right.
So, have you, kind of delved into that matter?
Yeah, so very much. So, and financial advisors do this with people, right? They say, oh, what would you do if the stock market loses 5%, 10%, 20%? And people tell them, oh, I'll stay, I'll buy. And then it really happens. And of course, when you talk about it in a paper survey, what would you do if the market went down 10%? There's no emotions. You're thinking about an abstract, as if it's the problem of somebody else. When the market really goes down 10% or 20% and you open your portfolio, emotions, you have no other way but having your emotions flare up. As a recommendation, by the way, we often tell people to try and make the decisions first before they open their portfolio. So imagine that I went to sleep last night and the market went up or down. And I want to think about the decision. And I want to think about the decision of whether to buy stock X. My decision about buying stock X is about from now moving forward. It's not about history. Maybe I read some in the paper. Maybe I realized something about, some dynamics in the market and so on. But I have and that's a thoughtful thing, right? I could say, oh, you know what, I just had this experience with AI, and I think this about electricity and so on, and therefore I believe that company X will go down. And if I think first, that's a good thing, because we're talking about predicting the future. On the other hand, if the first thing I do is I open my portfolio, three possibilities: nothing happened, okay. The market went up, in which I'll be extra happy, or the market will be down, in which I'll be extra sad. But my happiness and sadness are certainly not inputs you would want to include in what will happen to company X.
Right.
So basically, let's try to separate what happened to our portfolio from what we think will happen to the portfolio. And therefore, if you're thinking about making a change to your portfolio, try to think about it before saying exactly what happened to your portfolio today. That would help you clean your mind in a better way. Another thing that we tried and was very good is to get people to write a letter to their future self. Dear Rich, I looked at my portfolio and I decided that when the market goes down 10%, I'm not going to sell. Just remember, dear Rich, dear future Rich, at some point the market will go 10%, and at some point at that point you would want to sell everything. But remember that I want you not to sell, and we want that reminder, because when we answer these surveys about what will happen to our money, it's not a real commitment to anything. But committing to a strategy is is very important. By the way, another interesting trick is to rebalance your portfolio. And people think that rebalancing their portfolio is good because it rebalances the portfolio. So if I had a strategy of 50-50, I want to stay at 50-50. That ends up not being that important. But what rebalancing your portfolio does is it forces you to sell high and buy low. So imagine you have a portfolio and imagine it's 50-50. And imagine stock goes to 60 and bonds go to 40. If you rebalance, what do? You're forced to sell what's up and buy what's low.
Right.
So rebalancing really ends up being a really interesting self-discipline strategy of selling high and buying low, which is so difficult to do, right? If you had a 50-50 strategy and today it's 60-40 and you don't have a discipline to say, oh, twice a year I rebalance, you would say, oh, but stocks are going up. Shouldn't they keep on doing that? So at the end of the day, I'll tell you one other funny anecdote. There was a quote by Fidelity, and they said that they analyze all their customers to see who are the customers that make the most returns on their portfolios. And their answer was it was the dead ones. It's because, because we are really not designed to make good decisions in those environments, right? It's just not like if you say, let's create an environment that is conducive to high quality human decision making. This wouldn't be it.
Yeah.
Right? There's lots of room for error. So you say, in total, play dead is the
that's a great strategy. In one of your earliest novels, books, Predictably Irrational, you talk about arbitrary coherence. I'd love to
don't say novel. I did. Yeah, it's a research book. I did work on some fiction stuff, by the way. I don't know if you know, but I helped write a TV show for NBC that was loosely based on my life.
Yeah.
2 seasons came out, but yes. But anyway, this was one day I'll write fiction, but this was not fiction.
Well, and I saw in your TED Talk you wanted to do one on the kitchens also on
That's
cooking.
right. One day I'll get to that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's coming up. But yeah, in Predictably Irrational, you talked about arbitrary coherence, and I'd love for you to kind of explain that in the context of stock prices and valuations and things like that.
Yeah. So arbitrary coherence is the idea that we compare things to similar things, and we price things compared to versions of themselves, and it makes us feel as if the laws of supply and demand are effective. So how much is a big bottle of ketchup? Twice as much as a small one. And how much is a big bottle of a big box of toilet paper? It's twice as much as the small ones. But is the absolute amount of money that we are willing to spend on ketchup related to the pleasure we get from toilet paper? Like, are we really making those trade-offs? And in the standard economic model, money is this is a common good, and we basically, through money, we decide, oh, should I buy more ketchup or more toilet paper? Where is my money better spent on those things? But what we find with this research is that while big bottle is keeps a relationship to the price of the small bottle, the absolute category is not necessarily price connected to the other one in any relative sense that would make sense. And instead, what we do is we have kind of an idea of how much we're willing to spend per category. So it gets kind of strange because we compare the price to beer and the price to wine and the price of milk to milk, and nobody's ever saying, for the difference between this milk and this milk, I can buy slightly better wine. Like, it's not about this. Like, nobody's saying what should be my ratio of milk to wine in my refrigerator. No, we compare milk to milk, and we see two bottles of milk, and we look at them very carefully, and so on. And we look at two bottles of prices of wine, and we look at them very carefully. So within a category, we look very carefully, but we don't think very carefully about the cross-category comparison. And the truth is, it's just very difficult, right? If I ask you, compared to your spending on coffee, how is your spending on fruit? Like, where are you in the efficient frontier of spending on coffee compared to fruit, or computer gadgets compared to cars? It's a very, very hard question to do. We think that money helps us make these decisions, but the reality is that money is very abstract and it's really tough. If you ask me, people sometimes use the phrase, it's like comparing apples to oranges. Comparing to apples to oranges is trivial. If I show you an apple and an orange, say, which one do you feel like right now? You can tell me.
Right.
But if I ask you, is an apple worth 90 cents? And if it was 92, it would not be worth it for you. And what about if it was, $1.50? Would you not buy an apple anymore right now? And you realize that the trade-off between things have an emotional, what we call hedonic impact on us. Here's an apple, here's an orange. I predict the enjoyment from each of them. $1 versus an orange, I don't know. Now, if it was $100, it's easy, but 10 cents. But in a reasonable range, it's really hard to do. So what do? We make these decisions as a function of the decisions in the market. So you ask lots of people, how much would you be willing to pay for a can of Coke? People give you basically the same number. Slightly higher if you're in an airport, maybe tiny higher if it's a warm day, but it's basically the same price. How can it be? How can it be that everybody values Coke in the same way? It's because we don't really know how much we value Coke. We basically repeat the MSRP, the starting price. Oh, that's what it costs. That's what I'm willing to pay. And when we think about stocks, I think it's kind of true. The market kind of decides if right now we are paying more for private equity or we're paying more for public stocks. And what are we compare manufacturing companies to other manufacturing companies, and we compare technology company to other technology companies, and it's not exactly about the true value. Now, is it as bad in the stock market as it is in the food market? No, because in the stock market, at the end of the day, there are profits and there's more common language between them. But the problem still exists. The problem still exists that it's easy to compare the price of Amazon now to what it was. That's an easy comparison. Amazon did this, the price went up, and this, or went down, and this. It's easier to compare companies to similar companies. And when companies become very different, the comparison between them becomes very tough.
Yeah. Well, and to kind of keep on the theme of looking at some of your writing, in the upside of irrationality, you show that irrational behaviors can sometimes benefit us. What would you say the positive irrationalities are in long-term investing? Like, for the listener who is, a long-term investor, which is what we encourage, what are the positive irrationalities?
Okay. So, I'm going to tell you something that has been kind of a big focus of interest of mine for the last 8 years.
Sure.
So, for the last 8 years, I've been looking at data for how companies treat their employees, how the employees feel about the company, and what that means for the performance of the stock of that company. And I have data going back to 2006 until today, and I examine lots of things. And what we find is that some elements of what we call human capital make a big difference. Others don't. So you asked me, how do we think about irrationality in a positive way? Human motivation is amazing. And I'll put you on the spot if it's okay.
Sure.
Think for a minute about the three things you're proudest in your life. Don't say them out loud. Think about them. How many of them were accompanied by many moments of joy, and how many of them were accompanied by more tears and agony and complexity than joy? In general, when people think about this, they say, most of the things I'm proud of were not just moments of laughter, whether it was starting a new company or writing a book or having kids. Most of these things were difficult and complex and painful. They're more like hiking Everest than sitting on the beach drinking mojitos. And all of this is just to say human motivation is incredibly irrational. We love things that are complex and difficult and challenging. We like running marathons. We like helping other people. Like when you really think about human motivation, you realize that it's not a rational thing. So when we collect data on what it is that companies create in their employees and employees feel about the company that make a dent in alpha, in stock market return, it ends up having nothing to do with extrinsic motivation. We usually think, let's pay people more. Let's give them more vacation. Let's give them better health benefits, better retirement benefit. We find zero, almost, not zero, but very, very low correlation, predictive value between those elements and stock market return. On the other hand, when you think about intrinsic motivation, all the things that are irrational, big difference, right? So for example, number one thing that we find is important is whether you feel appreciated. From a standard economic class, I say, appreciation, pay me. Why do I care about appreciation? Turns out appreciation is unbelievably important. Turns out I told you that salary doesn't matter. Fairness in salary matters a lot. Feeling proud about your workplace means a lot. Feeling connected to your direct manager matters a lot. So at the end of the day, what we find is that when you think about stock market returns, a lot of this market is very functional. And I take this data out and I show it to different investment managers, and they usually say, I want objective measures. And I say, no, you don't. I said, let's take two very important things. Let's say I want to ask you how much you love your significant other, and let's say I want to ask you in how much pain you are. I say, there's no good objective measures of those. I could wire your brain and measure your sensors. Eventually, the love that you feel for your significant other, the best evidence I have is how much love do you feel right now. It's not how many emojis you send today. And the same thing is true about pain. If I want to understand your pain, it's about your subjective experience. And I say, look, human motivation is eventually about the subjective experience. If you feel that you're being treated unfairly, I don't care if all the objective measures show that you're being treated fairly. Yes, maybe it would be good for lawyers to discuss, but from a human motivation, I care what do you feel. So we started an ETF about 3 years ago. October we'll have 3-year anniversary for the ETF, and so far it looks really good, and I'm very proud of it because when we started this, I could have written another academic paper, and I could have said human motivation. Here's another paper on human motivation, and here's another thing, but I think this is like I hope kind of the real good evidence that companies should. First of all, it's a really good evidence. It's a good investment strategy, but it's also a really good point that companies should start looking more internally at human capital. And one final thing about this is, I think that companies not treating human capital as an asset is an accounting mistake. And what I mean by that is when a company buys a warehouse, it's an investment. Mm-hmm. When companies invest in their people, it's a cost. That's just a mistake, right? I would want to see on the asset, on the balance sheet, how much you're investing in human capital.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I hope we'll get there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and it is interesting to see more and more companies, kind of have the title of, kind of human capital management, as a department, taking, that view to heart.
yeah.
You explore in some of your writings, you explore the meaning behind motivation, and I guess what is it that you see that motivates people to save and invest long term, even if you don't get the immediate reward?
Yeah. So so investments in the long term is a very, very tough thing to do because doing nothing feels wasteful,
Right.
right? Sometimes you come to somebody, do nothing. Like as we said, the dead investors do very well. That it's about overriding our instinct and doing the right thing. So there are lots of things like this in the world where we're usually waiting for an outcome to reward us, but we need to reward the process. And imagine you have two kids. One of them is studying to the exam very well. They study 90% of the material, but it just so happened the exam had a lot about the last 10%, and they did so so. The second kid studied so so, but most of what they studied was in the exam, and they did very well. Which kid you should congratulate and tell them to keep on doing what they're doing? The kid who studied well or the kid who did well? Of course, everybody knows the answer. It's about the kid who studied well. Why? Because in the long term, this will be the strategy that worked out, even though in the short term, the other kid would be saying, oh my goodness, I got a good grade and I didn't spend too much time on this, right? It's very tempting to feel rewarded when this is the case. But an example of a case where you want to reward the process. Now, the reality is that the world doesn't always reward the process. So what we need to do is we need to reward it. So if you want to be kind of a process investor, you say, look, I know the stock market is random, there are fluctuations and so on. I want to have a strategy where I invest X amount of dollars once a month and so on. I rebalance twice a year. I look at my portfolio 4 times a year. Here's the rules. The next thing you do is you set up a reward for what you do. You don't set up a reward for what happened in the market. Like if you put money in the market every month as you promised and you rebalance twice a year as you promised, regardless of what happened in the market, you deserve whatever you decide: a cookie, a coffee, a bottle of whiskey, right? So what we need to understand is that the world doesn't always reward the right behaviors. So we need to create the contingency. We call this reward substitution. We need to create the contingencies where we would reward the right behaviors. So think to yourself, make a rule, what it is that you want to control. Now, you can change it from time to time, it's all, but what it is that you want to control, and then figure out your reward structure for that, right? I'm going to once a month when the automatic deduction goes, I'll drink a fancy coffee. Once a year, twice a year after I rebalance my portfolio, I'll have a good bottle of wine after that. But reward the process regardless of what's happening, because the market is not necessarily going to reward the right process. So we need to create another layer of that.
Yeah. And yeah, and kind of on the back of that, what's the biggest, how do I phrase this? What's the biggest myth with regard to money, with an investor's money, that you set out to in your book Dollars and Cents, which is obviously very germane to what kind of our listening audience cares about? What's the biggest money myth you set to debunk in Dollars and Cents?
So I would say that I'll answer it slightly differently. One of the most interesting finding we had was with this study we did in Kenya. And what we did was we created this coin that people put in their hat, very, very poor people. And they scratched the coin. The coin had marks for 24 weeks, and people scratch week 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 24. They scratch it like a minus if they didn't save, and they scratch it up and down if they saved. And that coin more than doubled savings compared to a 20% match. And the question was, why did they come up with this coin, and what was the whole story? And generally speaking, when we make money, we can do one of two things with it. We can do things that are visible, and we can do things that are invisible. Visible things is buying a candy to your kid, or bike, or a t-shirt, or something like that, something that you would see, other people would see. Invisible thing is paying debt, investing, buying insurance. And in general, it's much more tempting to do visible things than non-visible things. Think about how much you know about your neighbors. You know a lot about them in the visible world. What shirts they buy, what cars they have, when they renovated their kitchen. You have no idea about the invisible stuff. How much debt they have, when they pay their credit card bill, insurance, saving rate. So when we have some money, we have to understand that there's this temptation to do visible things rather than invisible things. I ask people, I say, look, if you're a breadwinner of your family and you work hard and you do lots of things, how appreciated do you feel? Most people feel unappreciated. Not 100%, but not appreciated enough because it's invisible. It's invisible. So if I work all day and I come and I bring my kids, a cookie or a new gadget, they will say thank you, maybe smile at me. If I put more money in the college saving fund, nothing. How do we hope to compete that? And that coin in Kenya basically made the invisible visible. The parents basically communicated to themselves, to their spouse, to the kids, hey, there's an economic activity out there. And I think that one of the things that we don't understand is what a tough task the invisible stuff is. Insurance, saving, investing, paying debt. It's a task that people feel. If you ask me what is the big takeaway for me, the big takeaway is that we're asking people to run a marathon on things they don't get rewarded for. We say, okay, you make some money, and now do with it things that nobody will say thank you for, maybe in 30 years from now. What a tough task. And the question is, I don't think that the coin is the exact thing that people should do, but I think people should feel a way to feel good with themselves. If I make money, how do I say, oh, you know what? Let me direct it into investing rather than going on a better summer vacation. Right. In fact, my kids might be angry if we don't go on a good summer vacation. How do we do that? So my sense was that when I go back and I take the hat of the individual investor, the individual saver, the individual breadwinner, we need to understand that we're asking them to do things that are really tough. And what we need to do is to help them in a big way. And part of it is to say, like, imagine you say, like, you take the coin and you mark in your calendar, here's the number of weeks and months that I saved. And maybe you share it with your spouse. I'm not saying, put it on a billboard with other people. Maybe put on the refrigerator a table of how many more payments you have on your mortgage. But make things that would make you feel that you're making progress. Do things that make your spouse feel your contribution. I think we don't have that enough. It's a too much solo sports. And I'm not saying, sit with your spouse and start talking about everything, but give them a sense of the sacrifice and the effort and the attention that goes into this. For a long time, I felt I was kind of the main bread maker of the family, and it was just not appreciated. And how can you find the energy to do it if you don't feel that? Anyway, so I think for me this was the biggest revelation, and it happened with these very, very poor people. And since then I've been thinking about how do we make that more general, because the problem is very obvious there. There it's like, if you save or put money away, there's less food on the table in a very immediate way. For most of us, the problem is not as bad, but still, the question of motivation is incredibly important.
Yeah,
So that, I
it's
think,
actually,
was
I'm just thinking as you're kind of laying all that out, I'm thinking about things like, here in the States with 529 plans for, anybody out there who's a parent. It's kind of a quiet, lonely thing, funding that 529. You don't
yeah.
talk about it out loud all that much, but if you get to that point where you've accomplished it, it's a big deal.
It's a
Paying down
very
the
big deal.
mortgage, like you said,
And
having benchmarks.
but don't wait until you finish. Like,
Right.
imagine that you say, here's the payments table for the 529, and yes, we made another payment, and yes, we made another table. And by the way, this is part of a bigger conversation that I don't know how to have about how do we talk about money.
Mm.
I mean, you're doing it in lots of forms. I mean, but people just don't talk about money. When was the last time? Maybe it happens to you because of your role, but when was the last time people came to you and say, you know what, I'm in debt, I don't know what to do, any piece of advice? Or people can talk a little bit about saving, but not so much, not so
Yeah.
much. But we um, anyway. So I think that understanding our own motivation, understanding what would get us to do more of the invisible compared to the visible, communicate to ourselves, like, think, I am doing my job as a breadwinner.
Yeah.
And here's a communication with my significant other, and maybe some communication with the kids. I think it's a really big thing. We focus on, do we invest in more stocks or more bonds and so on. The real question is, how much money do we put there to start with?
Yeah.
That's the larger question.
Well, and everything you just kind of laid out feeds into something I was thinking about. Like I mentioned at the top, you had that column in the Journal for Wall Street Journal for 10 years, and you gave practical advice on using or putting to work behavioral insights. What were some of your favorite or maybe most controversial takes or kind of replies or responses? Anything stand out?
So I'll tell you about one that was very memorable. So in Predictably Irrational, I wrote about bandage removal, quick or short, and this woman wrote me, and she told me that they just found out that she has brain cancer, and she said she wants to know whether to tell her kids all at once or to tell them slowly. So she made the metaphor of saying, "Oh, I have cancer. This stage, this is this." Oh, she'd say, "Oh, we have a test," and take them slowly through that. Obviously, she was making the metaphorical connection with the bandages, and it's not exactly the same thing. But she lived in New York, and I was heading to New York the day after, so we decided to meet face to face, and we had a chat about that. And eventually, we decided to tell them all at once because of trust. Because eventually we understood that, again, metaphors have benefits and weaknesses. The weakness of her metaphor was that in the bandage removal, there's no question of trust. Whereas if she told her kids and they found out that she hid information from them, they might not trust her in the future.
Sure.
So that was a very interesting experience. By the way, she did live for a few years after that. But that was a very meaningful thing for me, because I wasn't just kind of answering. I was very touched that people were making analogies to what I was thinking and talking about, and they were trying to find out the answers to their real life problems. Like, people were kind of pattern searching. Oh, I have this problem. What is it like? Oh, it's this like Dan Ariely thing about bandage removal. Let me try and find that. So that was one very meaningful one. Another one that you might like is that there was this retired couple, and they were living. They had good salaries, and they were living quite well until they retired. And when they retired, no income was coming, and they were not treating the interest on their assets as real income, and they became terribly stingy. And they were looking for a retirement, a good life. Hey, we got to retire. And then they got there, and they became very stingy. And they asked me, what is my advice? And I said, look, the problem is that you're taking every expense and saying, oh, if I take this out, it will shorten my assets. And you make it, multiple times. And every time it's painful and difficult. And you talk among yourself and it makes it worse because you both have this mindset. I said, give yourself a yearly budget. Give yourself a yearly budget. Take that money out of savings and put it in your bank account. I said, I know it's inefficient. I know you would not get the same interest rate and so on, but separate those two. So you're not taking from savings, you're taking from this pile that you have designated, what we call mental accounting, to be spent. And I said, then plus, and track how you're doing in which month of the year and so on. And I said, and promise me that if there's money left over at the end of the year, you'll give it to a charity. So in a sense, you're basically committing that you'll have less this money by the end of the year. I said, plus, if you really commit to that, you'll feel as if the charity is funding your life. I took $100,000. It's dedicated to the World Wildlife Fund. Oh, now the World Wildlife Fund is really funding my life for the year. No, but it was a serious request because when people stop making an income and they start spending more than they make, it's a very, very tough psychological state. And people think that they'll get to retirement and they'll enjoy it, but if they're in the mindset like this retired couple, then they're really suffering. And they had enough money. They just had to get out of that mindset. So separating the accounts, promising that they'll spend it and so on, was another good advice. Anyway, yeah. It was really fun to write, but 10 years was about right.
That's a good run. Well, and we've obviously taken up quite a bit of your time, so maybe I'll wrap up with this. You're, in addition to being a writer and a scholar and a professor and everything else you've done, you've also founded and co-founded several companies. How do you decide when to jump into a business? Do you just come up with an idea, you and maybe a colleague, and hey, let's go do this, or what's your thought process there?
So, for example, the company I described earlier called Irrational Capital, I'm really good, excuse for the arrogance, in the very narrow things I do, not that good in anything else. I usually have an idea for something I want to do, and I usually look for a partner that I trust 100%. And what I always tell my partners is that I don't want to be involved in anything that I don't have something unique to contribute. So, for example, David in Irrational Capital has a carte blanche to decide anything that he thinks is right for the company. I don't want to report. Anything that I can contribute, I want to be there 100% of the time. But anything that you just need to be a generally intelligent person and have I trust you completely. And it's not as if this method has no hiccups. Trust is a complex topic. You trust people. For me, at least, trust has mostly worked very well. Sometimes it backfires, and then you need to take a big breath and say, I decided on trust as a strategy. I'm not going to be overly influenced by this one incident and so on, which I do. But it's always like being betrayed is tough, and you need to remind yourself that trust is still a good strategy. But I usually have an idea. It's usually heavily based on something that I think is correct from social science, something I think I'm an expert on. And then I look for a partner to do something with, and I trust them, fully. And it's been a very good it's been a very good strategy for me. one of the startup one. So Irrational Capital is one of the startups. Another one that I have now is a company that is looking at the last chapter of life.
Mm.
We're looking at the time between people get diagnosed with terminal illness and the end of life. In the Western society, it's a chapter that is slightly longer than 5 years. And we're trying to analyze all the ways in which people make suboptimal decisions in this chapter, and how to make that better. And so I've been doing research on this topic for about 4 years now, and the startup has been around for a couple of years. And a little bit more than 2 months ago, my mother passed away. And I had the challenges and the privilege to help her, end her life on her own terms when she wanted to. And it was kind of a very, I know a lot about the topic. I learned a lot, but still, being involved personally with my mother, who I was very connected to and loved dearly, was very, very tough.
Yeah.
But often tough experiences, we learn a lot from those.
Sure. Wow. Well, gosh, Dan, Ariely, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. For the listeners, there's a catalog of books out there, including Predictably Irrational and The Upside of Irrationality and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and 7 or 8 more TED Talks everywhere. It's been a real pleasure bringing you on The Motley Fool again. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. It was lovely.
Excellent. Take care, Dan.
You too.